Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Tim the Composer's podcast. I'm Tim and I'm a composer, and I'm going to talk to you about what is called today classical music. It wasn't always called classical music. That's another story for another time, but please have a listen to episode 0 of this podcast where I talk about what I'm on about when I say classical music and what this podcast is supposed to be all about. But for now, we're going to talk about Beethoven, and in particular, Beethoven's First Symphony, because why not? This is the first episode of my podcast, so it's called First, and it's about Beethoven's First Symphony. And I want to look at why he wrote it. What was he thinking? Try and get into the mind of Beethoven a little bit, perhaps. But first, we need to rewind. We need to rewind to 1792, which is 8 years before he produced this First Symphony and unleashed it upon the world. And in fact, when he did do that, he changed the entire idea of what a symphony might be. But first, 8 years beforehand, 1792, Beethoven is living in Bonn, in what is now Germany, and he's going to move to Vienna. He moves to Vienna in 1792. But why? Why does Beethoven move to Vienna? And this was a hugely important move for his life. But he was a young man. He was in his early 20s. He had grown up in Bonn. He had 2 younger brothers, Karl and Johann. In fact, they were the only survivors of 7 siblings. Beethoven was an incredibly gifted, talented pianist. He was famous in Bonn for piano improvisations in particular. He had started to compose a little bit. But this is a world, 1792 and before then, in which, yes, there is a Ludwig van Beethoven who everyone has heard of today, but in those days, he was just a 20-year-old young man. This was a world in which there was no Beethoven. Imagine that. I think it's very strange. It's a bit like when you watch a film that Tom Hanks is in, Saving Private Ryan, for example, or Forrest Gump. Let's say Forrest Gump. In that world, there is no Tom Hanks. So it's a strange world. It's exactly like ours, more or less, except there's no Tom Hanks. So imagine the world in which Beethoven lives, and imagine you live in that time. There is no famous Beethoven of the famous Fifth Symphony or the Ode to Joy of the Ninth Symphony or everything else we know about Beethoven. Anyway, it's the 1790s, and Beethoven is living in Bonn. He's a great pianist. He grew up playing the Well-Tempered Clavier of Bach, which is a collection of preludes and fugues, some of them quite straightforward, some of them very difficult. Apparently, when he was 11, he was able to play the whole thing, which I think most pianists today would struggle to play the whole thing in their entire lifetime unless they're a professional pianist. Extraordinary. His father, who was called Johann, tried to push Beethoven down a musical career when he was young. There were famous musical prodigies at the time, most famous of which was Mozart, who was able to play amazing music and to write amazing music when he was just a toddler, really. Johann thought, well, Beethoven's talented, good at music, let's push him, let's make him into the next prodigy. In fact, he lied about his age on a concert program at one point, said he was 6 when he was 7, something like that. But his father was quite overbearing from the sounds of it, and actually became dependent on drink and quite angry and perhaps violent later on. So perhaps it wasn't the most happy household that Beethoven grew up in. He was taught from the age of 5 on the violin. Apparently his teacher, who was called Tobias Pfeiffer, was an insomniac and used to drag Beethoven out of bed in the middle of the night for a violin lesson. He was also an organist. He was the court organist. Now the court, let's talk about the court. In Bonn at the time, there was an elector. The job of an elector was to elect the Holy Roman Emperor. There were 8 of these electors in total, and one of them was the Archbishop of Cologne, who is based in Bonn. Now this Archbishop elector was Archduke Maximilian Francis of Austria. His full name, which is worth reciting because it's quite a grand name, was Maximilian Franz Xaver Joseph Johann Anton de Paula Wenzel. He was the Elector of Cologne then, and he was also the Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights, the youngest child of the Holy Roman Empress Maria Theresa, and his sister was Marie Antoinette, the last Queen of France before the Revolution. So there we go. He was the Elector of Cologne, Archduke Maximilian, and he was living in Bonn. He had his court in Bonn at the time. In fact, it wasn't just any old court. We're talking about the Electoral Palace. The Electoral Palace in Bonn. It's a pretty gigantic building. It's still there now. It's now part of the University of Bonn. It's their main building. But you can find a photo of it online. It's a huge, gigantic building. And let your imagination run wild with what it was like in the 1780s at the Electoral Palace, the court of the Elector, the Archbishop, the Archduke Maximilian, and his young court organist, one Ludwig van Beethoven. So the Elector was quite an important figure in the local aristocracy in Bonn. And there were various other minor aristocrats around, and there was a sort of high society that grew up around them. And commoners like Beethoven and his family would have jobs within either the court or the household of an aristocrat and keep them, there might be a job, simple job like a gardener or a servant or something like that. Or in Beethoven's case, he was first the assistant organist and then the organist of the court. The aristocrats and the counts and the nobility and all the rest of them, they have a big impact on Beethoven's life, and in fact the life of everyone who wasn't in the nobility in those times, of course. For this story I'm going to tell you, quite important to appreciate his life in respect of these nobles and what he had to expect from them and what they expected from him. This relationship between the nobility and composers in particular changed quite a lot later in Beethoven's life, and certainly in the 19th century and absolutely in the 20th century. And today, of course, today it's completely different. There isn't any relationship between composers and the nobility in general. But in Beethoven's time, very important. So who were his friends in Bonn when he was a young man? Well, he had a friend called Franz Wegeler, who was a medical student. He had a friend called Anton Reicher, who was also a composer and a flute player, a violin player. And Beethoven knew him because they both played in the court orchestra together. Beethoven played the viola and his friend Anton played the flute. I don't think Franz Wegeler played in the orchestra, but they were friends nonetheless. Beethoven would teach people music as well as being the court organist. He would teach the piano. Apparently, according to Wegeler at least, Beethoven didn't like teaching and always used to find excuses not to have a lesson today, but perhaps I'll give you 2 lessons tomorrow, that kind of thing. Didn't really like teaching. He developed a close relationship with a family called the von Breuning family, who had big influence on Beethoven's life, particularly early on. I think it was probably a nice, safe place for him to go to escape from his actual home and his difficult father. So Helene von Breuning really encouraged Beethoven a lot, and she gave him literature to read, poetry. She really schooled him in that. Also, Beethoven taught her children the piano. And one person he met in the von Breuning household was a person called Count Waldstein. Count Waldstein had a big impact on Beethoven's life. They were great friends. They became great friends. Beethoven dedicated music to Waldstein. Let's find out a bit about Count Waldstein, because he's an interesting character. Yeah, he actually grew up in Vienna, moved to Bonn. He was a diplomat. He was quite a military figure. He's really remembered today because of his patronage of the arts, in particular Beethoven. But Count Waldstein in 1787 had joined the Order of Teutonic Knights and moved to Bonn 1788, and that's where he met Beethoven, who was living in Bonn. So he was answering the call of the Elector, so Archduke Maximilian Francis, who was the Grand Master of the Order of Teutonic Knights. He had been knighted at the age of 26, became a prominent member of the local high society, close confidant of the Elector, worked as a diplomat until the French invaded Bonn. Now, the French invading Bonn was perhaps one of the reasons why Beethoven wanted to leave. There was this threat that the French, who had recently had their revolution, Napoleon was ruling them. They were rapidly expanding, shall we say, and the various nearby towns had been threatened and some of them had been taken by the French. So they were very much on their way to Bonn. It was perhaps a good time to get out. So Count Ferdinand Ernst Gabriel von Waldstein was there living in Bonn, got to know Beethoven. Now, what happened to Waldstein after Beethoven left and moved to Vienna? Well, Count Waldstein he really took a disliking to Napoleon. He decided to raise an army, the Waldstein Light Infantry. He put all his money into that. They never actually took part in a single battle, and eventually the light infantry were dissolved and Count Waldstein ran out of money. He spent the next years hiding from his creditors in London, of all places. Eventually returned to Vienna, and his money sort of ran out. And yeah, he actually spent 10 years in the British Army, believe it or not. He died very sadly impoverished in Vienna in the sort of early part of the 19th century. But, he's known today as being a patron of Beethoven. And he was a friend of Beethoven's in these early years in Bonn. So why did Beethoven decide to move to Vienna, this key event in his life? Okay, well, Beethoven was becoming well known as a musician, but in Bonn, which was a relatively small town, despite having an elector living there in Bonn. But it's quite a small town, and I think Beethoven really wanted to test himself against more prestigious musicians. And the most prestigious musicians at that time were found in Vienna. I think he was probably egged on by some of his friends, particularly Count Waldstein, who really believed in Beethoven's abilities. I think he was encouraged, therefore, to go to Vienna, and in particular this event which happened. Haydn, who was Europe's most prominent composer at the time, he was quite old by this point, but he lived in Vienna, and he went on tour to London. He went to live in London for a couple of years, and on his journey to London, Haydn passed from Vienna through Bonn on his way to London around about Christmas time in 1790, and went off to London, did quite a lot of important things in London. He wrote what are called the London Symphonies now, his final symphonies. And on his way back, the great retinue of Haydn stopped again in Bonn in 1792 now, this is July. And I think at that point, arrangements were made for Beethoven to go and study with Haydn in Vienna. Now, he couldn't go straight away. I think he wanted to go straight with Haydn, join his entourage and go straight to Vienna. But he couldn't go straight away because he had to get permission from the elector. Eventually, the elector did give him permission, and Beethoven was able to leave to go to Vienna. Now, that was a big, exciting moment in young Beethoven's life. You can imagine the time he's going to leave. He's gathered together with his friends. Franz Wegeler, the Anton Reicher was there, Count Waldstein was there, the von Breuning family were there, and they assembled a sort of a farewell book for him. Imagine these days, I suppose, you'd have a leaving card and everyone writes in the leaving card. Well, they assembled this little album or book, and they wrote some really nice things in it. Now, I've got written down here in this book some of the things which were said in this leaving book. Here we go. Now, this is 1st of November 1792, the sort of leaving party of Beethoven. And this is from Helen von Breuning, the woman who's really encouraged Beethoven all this time. And she's left it, and it's in German. I'm not going to read the German out because I don't speak German very well. But it translated, it says, "Friendship with that which is good grows like the evening shadow until the setting of the sun of life." That's what she wrote in his leaving card or his leaving book. But there's another thing which was famously written in this leaving book, and this was written by Waldstein, his friend Waldstein. This is quite famous. Waldstein writes in this leaving book, he writes, "Dear Beethoven, you are going to Vienna in fulfillment of your long frustrated wishes. The genius of Mozart is mourning and weeping over the death of her pupil. She found a refuge but no occupation with the inexhaustible Haydn. Through him, she wishes to form a union with another. With the help of assiduous labour, you shall receive Mozart's spirit from Haydn's hands. Your true friend, Waldstein." So this is 1792, and Mozart, the famous Mozart of Vienna, has died in 1791. So that's what he's saying, that the genius of Mozart is mourning and weeping over the death of her people, i.e. the death of Mozart. Haydn is still alive, clearly, because Beethoven's going to go and study with him. So Haydn, the inexhaustible Haydn, who has 104 symphonies at this moment. He's written lots and lots of music. But yes, Waldstein is saying, with the help of assiduous labour, hard work, you shall receive Mozart's spirit from Haydn's hands. That's the famous thing which is written by Waldstein in Beethoven's leaving book. He's about to leave. He's about to go and study with Haydn, about to go move to Vienna. But how does he get there? Now this might seem, well, I suppose it's obvious to us now. There were no planes, there were no cars. You can't just drive from Bonn to Vienna, which is, it's a fairly long drive, but you could get there in probably well under a day driving these days, but in those days you had to walk there if you were poor, or if you had a bit of money, perhaps you could get a stagecoach. Now, Beethoven took the stagecoach. He took the stagecoach to Vienna, which took about 2 weeks, I think, 10 days or so to get to Vienna on the stagecoach. What was it like in this little cramped coach being pulled by horses along, well, not nice tarmac roads like they are today, but quite rough roads perhaps? It's going to be quite cold. This is at the end of the year. It's in November. It's pretty cold perhaps. Maybe there's a leaky roof. Maybe it's crowded and cramped inside. If you had money, you sat on the inside. If you had less money, you had to sit on the outside in the elements. But I think Beethoven probably sat on the inside. What was the conversation like in there? Maybe there was someone who was incredibly boring that he had to listen to. Maybe there was someone annoying. Maybe there was someone that kept interrupting. Maybe there was someone smelly. I don't know. It's quite funny to imagine what it was like in this stagecoach. But one thing we do know is that Beethoven had with him, certainly for the first part of the journey, he had a companion, a friend of some kind. We don't know who it was, but we know he was with someone because they wrote down all of their expenses along the journey. And at a certain point, they split up. His friend went off another direction and the accounts ceased. But you get to see how much they spent on different things on the first part of the journey. And it's quite good to hear some of this. So and by the way, I'm reading this from a book called The Life of Beethoven by Thayer. Now, Thayer is an interesting character. He lived in Massachusetts in the United States of America, which was a very young country at the time. He had read this book, the first biography of Beethoven, which was written by someone called Schindler, who was a friend of, or an acquaintance of Beethoven's. And it's become known as a bit of an unreliable book. But Thayer, or Alexander Wheelock Thayer, he was born in 1817, so he overlapped with Beethoven, certainly for the last decade of Beethoven's life. He was a teacher in Massachusetts. He was a librarian at Harvard Law School, which was a pretty new institution. Now, he travelled to Europe in 1849 after having read this book about Beethoven, and he thought, well, he had heard that it was inaccurate. This biography by Schindler from 1840, he'd heard it was inaccurate, and he was clearly a fan of Beethoven's and a scholar. So he decided to travel to Europe to put the record straight and to gather up all the documents he could from Beethoven's life and publish a really good biography. Now, he didn't quite manage to do that quickly. He published 3 volumes, which came out in the 1870s when really Thayer was very old and didn't finish his magnum opus, which I think grew to 5 volumes. They were completed by his colleague Hermann Dieters. And then after he died, it was all finished by someone called Hugo Riemann, who eventually completed the whole big biography in 1908, and it was finally published in English in 1921. So 1921 feels, well, if not exactly recent, it feels like a year which is somehow a bit more familiar to us than Beethoven's time. And this copy of the book that I've got was published in Great Britain in 1960. Okay, so this book first appeared in Britain, where I am, in 1960, published in America in 1921. But 1960, that certainly feels like, sort of fairly recent. There's this chain of this book which goes right back to Beethoven, and this Thayer character actually spoke to lots of people who knew Beethoven, and he gathered together all these documents. And actually, one of the things he gathered, these expenses which were gathered up and divided up between Beethoven and his friend. So it somehow brings it closer to me. It feels almost in touching distance. There's Beethoven sitting in this stagecoach, gathering together his expenses. From Bonn to Remagen, 3 florins. From Remagen to Andernach, another 3 florins. There was a tip given to someone of 45 kreutzers. Now, kreutzers made up florins. There were 60 kreutzers, I think, to a florin. Tolls, another 45 kreutzer. From Andernach to Koblenz, 3 florins. Tips to Andernach, 50 kreutzers. So he gathers up all these expenses, and there's lots and lots and lots of them. Some of them are quite exciting, I think. Here's one. Tip because the fellow drove like the devil right through the Hessian army at the risk of a cudgelling. 1 small thaler. 8 dinner, 2 florins. Now, apparently there was an army, the Hessian army were bothering stagecoaches, and rather than be stopped and perhaps have some things stolen from them, perhaps be arrested, I don't know, the stagecoach driver just sent the stagecoach and all the horses straight through the army, didn't stop. And so all the grateful occupants of the stagecoach, no doubt, gathered together a tip for the driver, including Beethoven, who gave him 1 small thaler, 1 small silver coin. So then 10 kreuzers road money, supper 2 florins, tips, more tips, 14 kreuzers, grease money 14 kreuzers. I don't know what grease money is. Is it perhaps money which is paid to the coachman to grease the wheels, or is it a bribe? I don't know. Grease money. Tip for postillion 1 florin. So there you go. And they split up and they carefully added up all the money that they spent on supper and tips and grease money and all the rest of it, and they split it in half. Beethoven paid his bit, his friend paid the other bit, and that's all we heard. But we do know that Beethoven arrived in Vienna by the 10th of November. So it must have been, what's like in Vienna in November? Pretty snowing, perhaps? Cold? Rain? I don't know. He had to live somewhere. He had been given some money by the Elector. He'd been given 25 florins, I think, for the journey, and 100 florins to keep him going once he got to Vienna. Now, his life in Vienna, the first few years, he's known as a pianist. He's known as a great improviser. He writes a few compositions. He does have some lessons with Haydn and perhaps doesn't really get on hugely well with Haydn. He has some lessons with various other people. Salieri, for example, who was quite a famous opera composer and was quite famous for his relationship with Mozart, supposedly a great tormentor of Mozart, so they say. Beethoven also had lessons with someone called Albrechtsberger. He made various friends there in Vienna. Vienna is a city of, at this time, about 150,000 people, so it's much, much bigger than Bonn. Bonn was a city of about, or a town, should we say, about 15,000 or so at the time. Vienna, 150,000 people. It's the center of the world as far as music goes. And you've got all of these households there, each of which has these noble households, each of which has musicians employed. They have concerts going on all the time, balls going on all the time. There's no TV and radio to keep people entertained, but there's lots of live music. And so there's a big appetite for it. There's lots going on. There's lots of taste and influence going on, and people have different ideas about what's good music and what isn't good music. But really, it's the nobility who control the whole thing and pay for everything. Now, money was always on Beethoven's mind when he's in Vienna. He's constantly having to try to make ends meet. Now, he's been promised some money by Elector Maximilian Franz back in Bonn. He's having to write to him to get this money, to get this money sent to him, because it doesn't arrive. Now, the reason it doesn't arrive, actually, the French are really arriving at Bonn, and the Elector is having to flee and probably has forgotten all about poor old Beethoven, this young man he had promised to send some money to. But anyway, here's an example of one of the letters, really kind of crawling letter that Beethoven had to write to the Elector. Most worthy and most excellent Elector, most gracious Lord, a few years ago your Electoral Excellency was pleased to retire my father, the court tenor Van Beethoven. Now, to retire, his father had to retire because he was an alcoholic and a drunk and causing all kinds of trouble. Anyway, he retired. Letter continues, and by a most gracious decree to allow me out of his salary 100 Rheintalers, so as to enable me to have my 2 younger brothers clothed, fed, and educated, and also to discharge the debts which our father had incurred. I was about to present this decree to your excellencies Landrintmeisterei, who's someone that looks after the Elector's affairs. Now, when my father earnestly besought me not to do this, lest he should be publicly regarded as incapable of supporting his family by his own efforts, which he was, really, he added that he himself would pay me the 25 Rheintalers every quarter, and this was always punctually done. After his death, which was his father's death, which took place in December of last year, I wanted to avail myself of your most precious favour by presenting the aforementioned most gracious decree. I was horrified, however, to find that my father had done away with it. So he's been promised this money, this 25 thalers every few months, and his father has thrown away the piece of paper which says that Beethoven's entitled to it. Terrible, carries on the letter. Hence, with the most dutiful reverence, I beg your excellency graciously to renew this decree, and also to instruct your excellency's Landrentmeisterei to send me the previous quarterly amount which fell due at the beginning of February. Your electoral excellency's most humble and most faithfully obedient servant, Ludwig van Beethoven, court organist. So there you go. That's Beethoven having to send really a begging letter to the Elector, who doesn't really respond. And that's in 1793, I think that letter is sent. A little bit later, a few months later, here's another one. He's having to write again to the Elector Maximilian Franz in Bonn, most worshipful, most excellent and most gracious Elector and Lord. My sole endeavour is to render myself absolutely worthy of your Electoral Excellency's highest favour. With this in view, I have employed this year all the powers of my soul for the benefit of music, in order to be able, during the coming year, to send to your Electoral Excellency something that will reflect your magnanimous treatment of me and your sublime character in general more clearly than what is being sent to your Electoral Excellency by Herr Haydn. Now, just stop this letter for a moment, because what was that all about? Herr Haydn has sent, well, that's Haydn, the famous composer Haydn who's been teaching Beethoven, has sent the Elector some of the work that Beethoven has done, some of his compositions. This caused a bit of a problem because the Elector pointed out that all of the work sent by Haydn had been composed by Beethoven in Bonn and not in Vienna. And so, since the young composer was running into debt and not producing any work, he should come back at once to Bonn, get back to his organ. So that's what that's all about in the letter. Anyway, the letter carries on. In the confident hope that your Electoral Excellency will not deprive me of the favour you have once bestowed upon me, I remain, with the deepest reverence, your Electoral Excellency's most humble and most obedient Ludwig van Beethoven. That's how he writes to the Elector to try and get some money from him there. He does make some other friends in Vienna. One of his friends is a man called Nikolaus Zmeskal von Domanovich. This was a sort of a minor noble, someone who had a lot of vineyards, I think, in Hungary, had a bit of money. Anyway, they became friends, and I think perhaps they did a bit of drinking together. You can sort of tell from the tone of the letters. Here's one. He has been given a little bit of money by this Count Nikolaus. He writes to him in a totally different tone of voice to how he writes to the Elector. Most beloved Conte de Musica, may your sleep do you good, and for today we wish you a good appetite and a good digestion. That is all that a man needs to enable him to live, and yet we must pay such a high price for all that. Yes, dearest Conte, my intimate amico, times are bad. Our exchequer is completely empty, our revenues are coming in very slowly, and we, most gracious lord, are driven to condescend to ask you for a loan of 5 gulden, which we shall bestow upon you again in a few days. In regard to the instruments, we charge you to make the strictest examination, since if any deception whatsoever is detected, we intend to punish the criminal. So it's got quite a lot of humour to this. So punish the criminal, which would be Beethoven, of course, if he doesn't pay him back. Anyway, he signs it off. All good wishes, most beloved amico and Conte de Musica, your deeply attached L.V. Buffen. So he signs L.V. Buffen. I think he was given a bit of money by Nikolaus there, who was clearly very entertained by him. A little bit later on, 1797 now, he writes him another letter. And all the letters of Beethoven, by the way, you can find volumes of them. They're really interesting, I think, because they bring Beethoven to life. Really do bring him to life. You can almost hear his voice. But here's another one. He sends a little letter to Nikolaus Zmeskal von Domanovich. Most excellent Count of Music, he calls him now. We should very much like to have a bottle of your Tokay wine as soon as your stock happens to allow it. You may then deduct it from the bottles we graciously ordered you to send us. After all, we are damnably attached and devoted to you. Beethoven. Very different from the tone of voice he uses with the Elector. Here's another one. Dear Zmeskal, or Dear Zed, actually. He says, Dear Zed. So he's being very familiar with him there. And this is in 1800 now. If we can dine together today, then I prefer you to come to the Swan in the Neuermarkt at 2 o'clock. But please do not let me down. You're Beethoven. Send me a reply. He writes after that. Then just a little bit later, a few days later, most excellent Count of Music. Do please send me 1 or 2 quills, for I am really extremely short of them. You can't even afford pens to write music. As soon as I can find out where one can obtain very good, really first-class quills, I will buy some. I hope to see you today at the Swan. Adieu, dearest Count of Music, your etc. So there we go. He's writing to various people, asking for money, asking for quills, asking for all of this. And there's lots of letters you can read, what his life was like in Vienna. One more person he knew in Vienna who's quite interesting is Baron von Swieten. Baron von Swieten was known as a patron of music. He had musicians at his house all the time, put on all these events. Beethoven used to go and play at Baron von Swieten's house all the time. Used to keep him up late into the night, drinking and listening to Beethoven play the piano. Here's one example, a letter from von Swieten to Beethoven. Beethoven at this point is only 23. This is in 1794, Monday, 15th of December. So it must have been cold and snowing in Vienna. Herr Beethoven, If you are not hindered this coming Wednesday, I wish to see you at my home at 8:30 in the evening with your nightcap in your bag. Give me your immediate answer. Sviten. So why did he ask Beethoven to bring his nightcap, his night clothes? Well, it's because there was a curfew at 9 o'clock, which meant Beethoven would have had to pay a fee to get back home again. So Van Swieten is saying, well, you can come and stay at my house. You're going to play the piano all night long. Bring your nightcap because you'll be there past the curfew. So that's one of his patrons. It gives you a flavour of the kinds of things Beethoven's doing in his life in Vienna. So he is well known as a pianist, gradually becoming known as a composer. It's important to realise that there aren't really many public concerts that were given. A lot of these concerts happen in the houses of the aristocracy. So Beethoven's having to constantly really curry favour with the aristocracy. At the same time, over in France, there's this revolution that has happened. The monarchy has been overthrown. There's the Republic of France, and this revolutionary fervour is spreading. And I think Beethoven had quite a lot of sympathy with it. He didn't really like the fact that he had to constantly write in this crawling, creeping way to the elector, for example, to beg for money. And I think he did have some sympathy with the revolution in France and with revolutionary movements that were spreading across Europe. But of course, he couldn't say that out loud. So how else might he have done it? Well, I think we'll see something in this first symphony before we get to that. Concerts. So there aren't really any public concerts. There are some. Mostly it's in the small houses. Well, not small houses, they're quite big houses really, but some of them can contain orchestras. But there's lots of concerts going on there. Now, there are public concerts occasionally. They're called academy concerts, and they're usually put on in theatres in Vienna. Now, the theatres in Vienna usually will be putting on operas and plays. They're the most popular form of entertainment for the public to go and see, and they take place over the autumn and winter seasons. During the summer, the nobility leave Vienna. They go to their country estates because it gets very hot and very dusty in Vienna. Not much happens during the summer. In the autumn and the winter, you've got this opera season going on. There's rehearsals and performances of opera in the theatres. But before then, in Lent, in the run-up to Easter, opera is not allowed to be heard by decree of the rulers. Opera can't be heard. And so the theatres go quiet. But that doesn't mean you can't have instrumental music. So during the Lent season, there's an opportunity to rent the theatres because the theatres can't make any money through putting on opera at that point. So you can rent a theatre and you can put on a concert to try and show to the public, do a grand concert to really show off to them. So Beethoven does this first in 1795 when he makes his public debut. He performs one of his piano concertos, and at that point he's written 2 piano concertos, and it's not really certain which he did at his big public debut concert, but anyway, he did one of them. He also played one of Mozart's piano concertos. Now, Mozart's piano concertos, like Beethoven's, had a big cadenza part in it. A cadenza is when the piano soloist, who's been playing along with the orchestra at this point, the piano soloist goes off on their own, puts on something quite showy, it's improvised, shows off his improvisation skills, shows off his technical abilities at the piano, and then the orchestra comes back in and the concerto finishes. But these cadenzas then are the big showpiece for the soloist, who is Beethoven in this case. But Mozart was quite famous for doing these, so Beethoven's taken one of Mozart's piano concertos and puts his own cadenza in it, his own improvisation. Now, this theatre that happens in is the Burg Theatre. Now, Burg Theatre, it's a big theatre. Well, it's different in Vienna. It got rebuilt. It was opened in the 1740s, I think, and it closed in 1888 to be rebuilt as the whole of the centre of Vienna was being rebuilt. An even grander version was then built, and that was destroyed in the Second World War and rebuilt again. So with the Burg Theatre you can go and see now in Vienna is not the same one that Beethoven was in, but nonetheless it's very grand, and the one that Beethoven used and performed in and managed to rent in 1795 was a big grand theatre. I've tried to find out exactly how many people could fit in it just to get an idea of the size of it. And the final performance there, which was in 1888, just before it closed, there were 1,200 people came to it then. So we can imagine it's a pretty big theatre. So he rents it in 1795, makes his public debut. He then becomes well known to the public at large, the middle class, as well as all of the other assorted nobility, as a composer, as well as a great pianist. But he's put one of his piano concertos there now against one of Mozart's concertos. Mozart, of course, dead, but still famous as a great composer. And Beethoven's put one of his own alongside there. So he's really saying something with that, really making a statement. Right, before we get to the symphony, one little further detour. In 1799, he's teaching piano he's teaching this thing that he hated doing, but somehow he managed to do it. Nonetheless, he taught piano to the daughters of a Hungarian countess. Now, this Hungarian countess was called Anna Brunswick. Now, one of her daughters was called Josephine, and Beethoven fell madly in love with her. And I think she also fancied him as well. They had this kind of secret but quite passionate relationship. Josephine had to marry then according to her social standing, but they kept in touch. There were these love letters that went back and forth, and really Josephine was who he met in 1799. She was probably the most important woman in Beethoven's life. So he met her in Vienna in 1799. Right, so we get to 1800. It's the turn of a new century, and Beethoven wants to present a symphony, his first symphony, in public, in Vienna, in front of all the nobility, in front of all of the merchants, everyone who went to public concerts. So where does he do it? He does it, of course, at the Berg Theatre again, this 1,000-seater venue. What does it cost to rent the Berg Theatre, even in the off-season? There are no records that I can find to find out, but it seems like it was certainly something to rent this thing. It would be hundreds of florins. So what is hundreds of florins? Well, Beethoven, we know at the time, was surviving on perhaps 400 or 600 florins a year. But the rental cost, we think, was maybe, about 300 florins, something like that. We have only one data point I managed to find, which is a few years later, we know that someone paid 400 florins to rent that same theatre. So perhaps in 1800 it would cost 300 florins. I don't know, but thereabouts. But that's about half his annual income he spends in one go to rent this theatre. Imagine that. So it's a big risk. And we know he's having to beg for wine and quills and all the rest of it. And he's struggling a bit. He's having to teach, which he doesn't like doing. So he spends half his annual money on renting this theatre. He also has to pay some musicians. He probably has to pay some people to keep the place clean, all the rest of it. Staff, front of house, ushers. It's much more than just the rental fee. The musicians at that time of Vienna, there weren't that many professional musicians, so perhaps you didn't have to pay too many of them. There were lots and lots of amateur musicians who would sign up to do all kinds of things. The standard, therefore, was not the same as we might expect today from a professional orchestra who are absolutely brilliant. There was probably quite a mixed level of ability in Vienna in these orchestras at the time. So I do wonder what some of these concerts really sounded like. So nonetheless, he puts on this concert in 1800, and it's an academy concert, so the public can come along to it. A ticket, what does a ticket cost? It's maybe a couple of florins, maybe a florin or so. So if he fills the place, he's probably going to make a decent amount of money by the time he's paid all expenses. Quite a lot of the people, especially the nobles, will have to come for free because he's trying to curry favour with them, because he wants a gig at so-and-so's house, a gig at so-and-so's house. So he had to probably give a lot of tickets away for free. It's a big financial risk. Nonetheless, he does it. 1800. It's Wednesday, April the 2nd in 1800. Easter Day that year was on April the 13th, so this was in Lent. There were no operas going on. It's just before the big Easter weekend holidays, I suppose, and the big important church services. But Wednesday, April the 2nd, there's this concert in the Berg Theatre, Academy concert, organised by Beethoven. At this point, he's only 29, where he's going to put on his first symphony. The rest of the programme, there was his septet, which had been a very popular piece and remained a popular piece all the way through Beethoven's life. Beethoven actually didn't seem to like the piece particularly very much, was a bit annoyed that was one of his most popular pieces and not one of his more profound works. Anyway, his septet was done at this concert. A piano concerto, either one or two. Again, we don't quite know. One of these two concertos of Beethoven, and Beethoven played. There was some music by Mozart again. I think it was a symphony this time. And there's also some music by Haydn, some movements from The Creation. This is quite interesting. The Creation it's an oratorio, which means that there's a choir singing as well. But in this concert, they had just some orchestral music playing. But why would you pick some music from The Creation and not perhaps a symphony by Haydn or something else? Well, remember I mentioned Baron van Swieten, who was one of Beethoven's patrons kept him up, said, bring your nightcap to come and play the piano at my house. He wrote the words of the creation, which Haydn wrote the music for. So I wonder if Beethoven is doing it because he wants to gain favour with Van Swieten. Van Swieten is probably very proud to have written the words for Haydn's great big creation oratorio. So maybe that's why there's some music from the creation in this programme as well. But the final work in the programme was the first symphony. The symphony was dedicated to none other than Baron Van Swieten, Baron Gottfried Van Swieten, this great patron of Beethoven's in Vienna at this time. What does it mean to be a patron? Well, it doesn't mean that they are commissioning pieces of music as such. It's more like they will give a tip, I suppose, a tip to a composer if they thought they've done particularly well, or hand out a bit of money to a musician they thought have played in a particularly brilliant way. So it's very much dependent on how much they like you, how well they think you've done. So it's not really, you can imagine Beethoven feeling a bit, I've got to impress this guy, but also feeling a bit begrudging. Well, this guy who's incredibly rich, is he going to give me some money or isn't he? I don't know. How rich was Baron Gottfried van Swieten? Well, he wasn't the richest person in Vienna by any stretch, but he was wealthy, had an income of 20,000 florins a year. So if Beethoven had an income of maybe 600 florins, we know he did in his early time in Vienna. We also know that Mozart, at the end of his time in Vienna, when he was incredibly famous and doing pretty well, although wasting a lot of his money, I think, by all accounts, but doing pretty well, had an income of 800 florins from his job at the imperial court in Vienna. So you can really imagine from that how the difference in wealth between Baron van Swieten, who has 20,000 florins a year being generated from his estates. The other interesting thing about Baron van Swieten, well, he was a diplomat, a librarian, a politician. He was a patron of Haydn and Mozart as well as Beethoven. He invented the first card catalogue system for a library. One of his titles, he was the imperial librarian in Vienna, and he invented this card catalogue system. Before then, they had books, index books, which they kept records of which books that were kept in the library. But he thought, well, new books coming in, old books going out, these index books, these catalogues keep getting out of date. So he invented the card catalogue, which, well, we don't see them so much in libraries now, but they were certainly all the rage for a good couple of centuries. Card catalogues in libraries, all thanks to Baron van Swieten. Okay, so the other thing about Baron van Swieten, to give you an idea of his closeness to some of these composers, he was responsible for arranging Mozart's funeral. It's said that there was no money left to pay for this funeral, but Baron van Swieten dipped into his 20,000 florins a year and paid for it, arranged a whole funeral. He also arranged for a performance of Mozart's Requiem, which would raise some money for Mozart's widow. So he was very generous to the musicians that he knew. Beethoven is going to present this new symphony at this concert, and he's dedicated it to Baron van Swieten. So hopefully going to really impressive, get some money from it perhaps. But this symphony, the symphony at that point, up to now, has been a piece of music. It's for instruments only. There's no singing in it. Most of the music is played by string instruments, violins, violas, cellos, double basses. There are a few wind instruments as well. And by this point, it's a pretty standard lineup of what is in the woodwinds. There would be 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 2 horns and 2 trumpets. And that's a standard sort of lineup. And that was also a lineup of a kind of wind band called a harmonie. And this wind band was used in households for court functions, so often at balls, but also hunting parties and military reviews, inspections of soldiers and that kind of thing. You'd have this wind band. But the wind band would then go and play with the string players in orchestral music. Haydn at this point has written 104 symphonies. He's still alive, but he's really quite elderly and he's not writing so much music at this point. Mozart wrote 41 symphonies. So we can see it's a type of piece of music which a composer might write a lot of these pieces. Beethoven goes on to write a grand total of 9 symphonies, which doesn't sound a lot in comparison to Haydn's 104, Mozart's 41. So why only 9? Really, and starting with this first symphony, Beethoven changes the idea of what a symphony is. So if he does that, and he's going to go on to revolutionize things in that way, it's good to understand a bit about what a symphony actually was up until this point and where it starts from. It starts from the word sinfonia. It just means sounds together, playing together. It starts with just a group of musicians who are playing without singers, and the start of maybe an opera or something like that, where it's just the orchestra playing, would be called a sinfonia or a symphony. And it's not really a formal definition, but this idea of a symphony, as far as I understand it, it develops over 100 years, 150 years, to become, by this point, by 1800, quite a standard lineup. So it's 4 movements. 3 of those movements would be in a very similar format, where there would be a couple of tunes. The tunes then get developed in interesting ways and combined in interesting ways, and at the end you'd hear those 2 tunes again. Now, 3 of the 4 movements would be basically that's what you would get. So the first, the second, and the fourth movements would typically be that, what I've just said, where there's a couple of themes intertwined. But this third movement would be a dance movement, very often a minuet. Now, a minuet would have been very well known to everyone at the time, because you would dance to it. It's in 3 beats in a bar. It's not a waltz, which is the other famous thing that's in 3 beats, but a minuet, the very standard type of thing you would dance to. It's quite predictable. Each of the phrases is a very predictable length. So it's kind of quite a square sort of piece of music in 3 beats in a bar, quite, relatively sort of slow, something you could dance to without having to fling yourself around the place, which if you're in some enormous 18th century ball gown, you probably don't want to do. So quite a dignified little dance. And that's what you typically get in your third movement of a symphony. So that's the standard lineup. And the other thing which has developed over, let's say, the last century up to this point is what's called a tonal system. Now, it's quite important, I think, to understand this. And if you're not a musician, you might not get it straight away. But music comes in different keys. You would play in one key, and gradually you might play in other keys. But music would start off in one key. It would perhaps move into different keys that become more and more distant away from the home key that you're in, and then come back to the home key again. And by this system, which has evolved by that point, of starting in one key, moving to a more remote one, and then coming back again, that really gives music a structure which it didn't have much earlier on, perhaps in the 17th century. But by this point, 1800, music is very much dominated by this tonal system, as it's called, where you start in one key, you develop and go into different keys and come back to the home key again. And the symphonies up to this point would, again, absolutely follow this pattern of starting in a home key, moving remote and coming back home again. And they would be, to a greater or lesser extent, adventurous. Now, Beethoven becomes extremely adventurous in this piece of music. And you wonder, well, okay, where does he get that from? And we know that when he was very young, he played the music of Bach, the well-tempered clavier. And in the well-tempered clavier, Bach goes through all of the keys, explores them very thoroughly, does some quite strange and unusual things in terms of moving from one key to another. And Beethoven was absolutely grew up with that music, and it's in his fabric as a composer to adopt this stuff. And I think that he wants to say something big and radical by his first symphony here. The symphonies of Mozart and Haydn have been very well known. They're famous. There are lots and lots of other symphonies that were played at the time, and Beethoven would have played lots of them in the court orchestra back in Bonn, and would have come across lots in Vienna as well. So he really knows what's expected of a symphony, a big public declaration, big piece of instrumental music. Not an opera, sure, but it's a big piece of orchestral music, and it's a big statement nonetheless. So he's got to really say something quite bold here. And we know that he wants to prove himself. He's 29, he really thinks he's something. I mean, he is something. He's very well thought of as a pianist, but not so much as a composer yet. So this is a big statement in public. So what does he do in this first symphony? Well, I think it's really quite radical and sort of revolutionary. Now, bear in mind, has Beethoven got sympathies with the revolution that's going on? Napoleon's revolution in France? Well, we know that he does have some sympathy with that, but he can't really declare that openly to this nobility because he's constantly having to beg to them for money. So how is he going to perhaps show his revolutionary spirit but not say it out loud and not anger them? Well, I think he does this in this piece of music. What does he do at the beginning? Now, remember I said this system of keys is very important. So we know that the symphony that's in there in the concert program, symphony in C major. So you would expect to begin a symphony in C major, you would expect it to begin in C major. And I've got my piano here. So C major. C major chord. You expect it to begin there. There we go. C major. You'd expect it to be something like that. What does he do? He begins not in C major. He begins not with a nice C major chord which wants to move immediately away from C major. Can you hear that chord? It's very unstable. It wants to go somewhere. Where does it want to go? That's how he begins a symphony, by going immediately away from C major in the first chord, F major. But he doesn't stop there. The next two chords of the piece, still not in C major. What's going on here? And then the next chords of the piece. So you think we've got home there? No, that's G major. That's G major. And then he spends a little bit of time in G major before finally arriving in the home key after, pretty good 30 seconds or so, up to a minute perhaps. He finally ends up in C major with a nice quick tune. Back in C major. And the tune is based around those little three notes. So that's, I think, is really quite a strange thing to do. To begin a piece in C major, not in C major, and immediately in the first chord, moving away. And also with this very unsettling chord. You really want that to go somewhere. And the longer you hold it down, the more kind of uncomfortable it is to hear. And then you can release that to F major. And that's what he does. So he has this loud, dissonant chord at the beginning, marked F, which means loud, strong. And then he resolves it with a quiet chord. There. Now, that's quite something. He plays this chord on the orchestra, loud, to this whole concert hall, maybe 1,000 people there, full of nobles, wealthy merchants, and the rest of it. And Beethoven's there, and he plays this chord, which makes them feel uncomfortable. And is he saying, I'm not going to let you be comfortable until I say so. I, the composer, allow you to be comfortable again. Holds it, and then... I think this must have been incredibly radical for them. And I think the musicians as well, playing it, must have thought, what the hell is this? This is amazing. They must have either thought it was daring and shocking, or they probably thought it was very funny to begin a piece in C major, not on a C major chord. Musicians would have found that really quite entertaining. I think he's being quite naughty, perhaps, revolutionary, bold. He's saying, I'm in control now, not you, all you nobles and aristocrats and counts and all the rest of it, but me, the composer, the commoner. I'm in charge now. So, and this is the beginning of the century as well. There's revolutionary fervour of monarchs being overthrown. There's the army of France approaching Vienna, where it does come, a few years later. All of this is going on. That's what everyone's talking about. And Beethoven begins with this thing of, I'm in charge. You're not going to be comfortable until I let you be comfortable. I think that's what he's trying to do in that opening. What else does he do? He does quite a lot of other unconventional things in this symphony. Do you remember I said the third movement of the symphony is this minuet, something which you should be able to dance to, quite a gentle three in a bar kind of feel. Well, not with Beethoven. Not with Beethoven. He takes the minuetto and he writes his tempo direction, how fast you should play it. Allegro molto e vivace, so very quick, very lively, he writes. He also writes a metronome mark, a device to show you how fast to play something. He says it's going to be, 108 bars in a minute. It's not even beats in it, but bars in a minute. So it's like 300 beats to a minute. Incredibly fast. That's how fast he wants it done. Now, it's quite funny to play the tune of this minuet at the tempo that you would expect a minuet to be. It really sounds, dare I say, quite a boring tune, but you play it at the speed that Beethoven wants, and it suddenly becomes exciting. Everyone's expecting a minuet, expecting something they can probably maybe, if not actually stand up and dance, they can maybe tap their foot and feel the movements of dance. And then have this incredibly fast music to be played, that must have been quite shocking for them. So the tune... So there we go, quite a fast tune, but you play it at the speed a minuet should be played. quite a bit more boring, I think, than the very fast. Incredible. And then he repeats that twice, that little tune. But then he immediately, after that, so he's gone, immediately goes and I'm playing that to you because he carries on with that a bit, and we end up in there. By the time he's finished all this, that's not the key we began in. The key we began in was completely, he ends up in D flat major after about, 20, 30 seconds of music. He ends up in D flat major when he began in C major, and I think you can hear how very different those two are. He's playing around with keys immediately and really pushing at the boundaries of what's expected and what's acceptable with this fast, radical music. So those are two of the movements. Let's just briefly look at the last movement. The last movement of this thing. Now you remember the first movement, that chord, which he resolves there. Now, he does a similar trick in this last movement of the symphony. So he begins just on this held note, just holding that note. Do you think that must be an important note? Okay, your ear is latching onto that as being an important note. And then he goes, just his little scale. And then he holds there. You think, well, hang on. For a start, I was expecting that. And he just holds that. With a little pause over the top of it to hold for quite a long time. Again, he's saying, I'm the one who's in control now, and I've built up your expectations. I've now withholding the resolution of this, so I want to have... I'm sort of hearing... And I want that to be resolved to C major again, as it would be. But he holds that for quite a little while, and then he gets into this again, allegro molto vivace. He writes very, very quick. And we're in this nice friendly C major for a little while before we go off into a distant key and do some crazy things before finishing the symphony on a big, definitely C major ending. So you can see he's playing tricks again. He's building up expectations. He's saying, I'm the one who's in control. And this, I think, is very, very new for a symphony. And it certainly had a big impact on the audience. They did like it. There was a review. And in the review it says, one of his symphonies was performed in which there is a considerable art, novelty, and a wealth of ideas. The only flaw was that the harmony were used too much. So there was more harmony music than orchestral music as a whole. Now remember I said the harmony, that's the wind section. And if you listen to the symphony, you'll hear quite a lot of the wind section playing, and it might not sound that unusual to you, but it did to the listeners at the time, because they were used to the string players having all the important tunes, all the important music, and the harmony, these wind players who are known for playing at hunting balls and for military reviews and that kind of thing, not at a nice dignified concert, or certainly not having a prominent role in a nice dignified concert. They were given important things by Beethoven. So tunes played only on a wind instrument without strings, tremendously radical, shocking. If you go and listen to the music, you can listen out for the winds and see everything that they're doing and think, well, that was unusual at the time. And now, of course, we're used to all sorts of wind instruments playing all sorts of things, brass instruments, woodwinds. It's a hugely important part of the orchestra. It gives an orchestra a huge depth of colour and levels of volume. But then this was quite a radical thing to do, to actually give important jobs in the piece of music to the wind section. But that's what Beethoven did. It certainly shocked people a little bit, and it was new, it was revolutionary. So, how to listen to it then? Before I finish, I'm going to tell you about how to listen to this piece of music. You might not listen to much classical music. That's fine. Maybe you don't, but hopefully you're going to listen to lots more after listening to this podcast. So how do you go and listen to Beethoven's First Symphony? Well, it's quite easy to find. YouTube, Spotify, any of these streaming platforms. Get hold of a CD of it if you want to listen to a good old-fashioned CD or a record even. But it's easy to find. Now, you want to listen to a good recording. There are lots and lots and lots of recordings of this. I think really any professional orchestra that has actually made a commercial recording is going to be decent. So that you're not going to really go wrong. But if you want my recommendation for a particular conductor or particular orchestra to seek out, I always think when it comes to Beethoven that Sir Roger Norrington, who's a conductor, who's still alive, British conductor, had amazing ideas about particularly things like how fast Beethoven should go. Norrington takes Beethoven pretty fast, and some people have criticised him for that, but he's adamant. I actually spoke to him once, and incredible, had a phone call interview with him, and incredible to ask him about that, and he's absolutely adamant. Beethoven's metronome was absolutely working perfectly. He really meant to have all these incredibly fast tempos, and I go along with that. I think it's probably true. I think if I was a composer and I had this metronome, this brand new device, you'd make sure it was working, wouldn't you? And you'd have an idea. And he'd also write in words, allegro molto vivace, very, very quick. So I think Beethoven certainly did want things to be done quickly. So you listen to Norrington play. Norrington also has his orchestra called the London Classical Players. They're well known for playing on instruments of the time. So you'll get perhaps something closer to the sound that Beethoven had in mind, perhaps, than the most modern instruments. But even if you do listen to a modern orchestra play, if you're lucky enough to go and hear this in person, that's the best way to listen to this kind of music, is in person, in a concert hall, the way Beethoven intended. But, if you can't, get one of the recordings, go on YouTube, go on Spotify, go on wherever, iTunes, and find it. And find Roger Norrington if you can. I think he's great, but find someone else if you can't find him. And listen to it not just once, but I think you should listen to it, really several times. I heard a story of someone that was going to study art history, and the very first assignment they were given, they said, go to an art gallery, find a painting, and sit in front of it for 3 hours and write down everything you see. 3 hours in front of one painting. Well, the person that was writing this, and I can't remember who it was, so apologies if it's you, if you're listening. Apologies for stealing your story. But nonetheless, this is the story. They sat and they, in front of this painting, first sort of 10 minutes, oh my word, I've got to see it for 3 hours. And the first 10 minutes, they looked at the painting. It's a painting. It's a good painting, but it's a painting. What can I write down about this painting? After half an hour of looking at this, the cloak of the character sort of moves in the same way as that cloud. Oh, that's interesting. That shape is just like that shape. And after an hour, they noticed something else. And after 3 hours, they'd written pages and pages of all of these incredible details that they'd noticed in the painting. Now, I think you can do something similar with a piece of music like Beethoven's First Symphony. There's a huge amount of depth and detail to it, which you just won't get on the first listening. On the first listening, you'll get a big impact of what the music, you'll get carried along by the music, this incredibly fast, exciting music. You get carried along by that. But to really appreciate all of the details, I think you have to listen to it more than once. So why not spend this week or the next couple of weeks, find a copy of Beethoven's First Symphony and listen to it like 10 times, 20 times, 50 times. Just listen to it over and over again and see what you notice different each time. Because I think you will suddenly start to notice all of these little details that Beethoven put in there. These little jokes, these little revolutionary moments, these little shocks. What's he trying to... You'll get an idea of the overall shape of the piece, where one tune comes back, how each of the four movements are linked in interesting ways, and you'll start to hear that. I can't hear it for you. I can just say, listen to it over and over again. Listen to it as many times as you can, and you'll start to notice all of these things for yourself. And you'll realize that, hopefully, what an incredible piece of music it is. And perhaps if you can put yourself in the minds of people living in Vienna at the time, Beethoven's friends, Baron van Swieten, all of them, and think what it must have been like to hear this first performance of Beethoven's First Symphony. They didn't know, of course, what was going to happen next. What was going to happen next to Beethoven, how we would remember him today, is this incredibly great composer. He was just this young guy, this 29-year-old, showing off on the piano, showing off with his composing, but being brilliant and being revolutionary. So go and listen to that, and come back and listen to me again. There'll be another podcast in a week or so, maybe a couple of weeks. Not sure what it'll be about yet, but it'll be about another piece of music, another composer, and I'll tell you some of the stories behind it. But for now, that's me. I'm Tim the composer, and I hope you've enjoyed my first podcast about Beethoven's First Symphony. Bye for now.